Welcome to Jesus Changes Everything, a daily podcast dedicated to providing a fresh look at the ancient and glorious truth that Jesus not only reigns, but is busy about the business of bringing all things under subjection, that celebrates the wonder and the glory that he has been given all authority in heaven and on earth. Time once again for another segment that we call Life in the Blender, and I'm very, very happy to welcome as my guest the woman who shares this life with me in the blender, my precious wife, Lisa. Thank you, sweetheart, for being with me.
Thank you for having me again, honey.
You betcha. Well, today I thought we would talk a little bit about grandparenting, and there's a really happy reason for that. It's not like I daily keep a measurement of this, but we have had more time with Addison in the last week or so than we have probably a couple months before that. Mm-hmm. And it just, enough to notice. Yeah, and it's just been really great. Mm-hmm. And so I thought that would be a good thing for us to talk about. And of course, I have the pleasure of watching you be a grandmother to Addison. Mm. You do a wonderful job, and you're so loving and tender towards her. And she is such a sweet and happy baby.
She is, isn't she?
She is,
and she loves her pappy.
Well, she does love her pappy, and I think maybe we should set some background for some people who may not know, who may not have been tuning in mm-hmm. along the way. Mm-hmm. But let me explain a little bit, or maybe ask you to explain the shift from how much we used to be able to see her mm-hmm. to not so much until now the last couple of weeks, what's changed again. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
What are you looking for?
Well, I'm asking.
So we had Jessica.
That's exactly what I'm looking for. Okay. You're going great.
All right. So we had, it's always good to have a preemptive understanding. Jessica, our oldest daughter, came to live with us when she was pregnant with Addison, and we were embracing Grace and helping her just kind of get through that stage in her life. And in the midst of that, we had the blessing of being there to help with all the beginning months of Addison's life.
Right.
And about at her 9th month, her mommy finally moved on and got into an apartment.
Which was her doing, not ours.
Right. I mean, she, and as a mom, she had already been independent, but this was a very difficult thing for her to go through. And, but it was a beautiful orchestrated time in our life to have the sweetness of that baby and walk through the stages with Jessica. And even though Jessica is the oldest and she's had a lot of nieces and nephews underneath her, she'd never been a mom before.
Right.
So it was a real beautiful blessing to have her in the home and have me walk alongside her. And now we're awaiting another child, and Addison's going to be a big sister to another little sister. And so we've been helping a lot more with Addison as Jessica's appointments have increased, and I think due to COVID, they've really been very careful about socially distancing, and so it's been a real sweet blessing and now she's at the stage where she's walking and she's gibbering, and I mean non-snot, and she is telling a story, not in English, but in Addison, the language of Addison.
She knows exactly what she's saying.
Oh, she does.
Well, and one of the reasons we had her, not really long, but just a couple days ago, we had a serious weather event here in the area. We had
tornado warning,
mm-hmm. and that was a situation where, again, we have a home that has underground space, which is where we are right now, and so we thought it'd be safer for them to be here. And Jessica and the baby came over, and it also was a joy and a delight. I'm not. Well, let me put this. You mentioned Jessica getting increasingly independent after she had lived here for a while. Part of that was the job that she had and still has. Mm-hmm. And that meant some regular time for us to look after the baby when she was out working. And then COVID came, and that sort of pushed her job closer to home, and we had less opportunity. But I want to just hear from you what it's like to hold your firstborn's firstborn. I mean, doesn't that sort of put you back in time?
Oh, it does. And I think with Addison, it pushes me more back in time because she looks just like Jessica did.
Yes, yes.
I mean, it's uncanny. So, Addison's not the first grandbaby. We've got beautiful other grandchildren, but it has been a long time since a little baby has been in our arms.
And that reminds us, I think, that's something important for us to maybe give some counsel on, especially because Jessica was here in the house. There is this struggle or this balance that you have to have where, as a grandparent, you want to offer counsel, you want to be a help, you want to, at some level, guide and direct, but you also need to recognize you're not the parent. You're not in charge.
And you remember when you were a first-time mom.
Yeah. And did you have struggles with...
I didn't have struggles with like mother-in-law situations, I think, but I remember my friends' older mothers. Like I had one friend, she was adopted, and back in that day, the children did not have any spots on their shoes, and if the kids had a spot on the shoe and you didn't have it, more like that kind of stuff. You need to clean her shoes off. And so, and all the kids had certain types of hard leather walkers and more like that. I was, my mom did not, I was bottle fed. So all of my kids were not, they were all nursed. So my mom didn't know anything about that, but she was a very good grandmother to my daughters, and my daughters love her. And, she would fix their hair, fix their clothes, or pick them up from school and do different things. But during the time when I had the kids, other than her bringing a meal and maybe offering to help hold the other babies, I never had a pushy mom.
How about, did you feel the temptation to be a pushy mom when you're dealing with Jessica and Addison, particularly when they're in our house?
No, not at all. I never felt pushy in regards to how she should. I mean, I think, and also with Jessica being in her 30s, she's a very private individual.
Yes.
She's been most of her from her youth up, and trying to make sure that you tread lightly, so to speak, so that she understands she's fully supported, but she's not being looked down upon,
right, that's
or
what I'm
she's
trying
not
to get
being
to.
disrespected in any way. And I think Jessica felt that. I think she has voiced that. I think that is something that, as whether you're a mother-in-law or whether you're a mother, the goal is always family unity. It isn't, these are my children and these are your children. It's when you're a family, we're all a family. So
We are.
what we want to do is keep embracing that.
But we are all a family, but you and I are the heads of our family.
Yes.
We're not the heads of her family. But we are there for support and encouragement, just like you said. And, with Jessica, she is a firstborn, and it shows. And you mentioned she's 30. It's not like
35.
Yeah, she's not. It's not like she's a kid who doesn't know how to be a responsible adult. So there wasn't a lot of hair pulling, like, oh my stars, how could she do that? There's never any question of the baby being in any danger. She is very careful and cautious. In fact, she would, politely but graciously, look over my shoulder to make sure I was doing the straps right in the car seat and stuff like that.
Or she'd just gently, after you were dead, make sure
do it again.
But I mean, she was reading Addison little stories when Addison was just, a couple weeks old. She'd sit and read her stories. And that's what I did with my kids. They all had their own individual books, and they were all addressed to the children with special little messages in them. And
well, I know you know this, but men have a propensity to, their appreciation for babies tends to skyrocket when the baby's able to communicate.
Mm-hmm.
And we're at this stage right now with Addison where she's isn't able to communicate. That is her emotional status. She does communicate. She's trying to communicate with the jabbering, but she's not speaking English. But it's for me as a grandfather, it's a delight to be at the stage we're at now because she is so expressive.
Mm-hmm.
But I still have that to look forward to when
Mm-hmm.
she's going to start speaking.
Mm-hmm.
But gosh, she smiles and her face lights up, and
she's delicate.
She is delicate, but she's also very loving.
Oh,
and
she's very
cuddly is the
yes.
word I'm looking for.
Mm-hmm.
So we're very, very blessed by that. And we look forward to, we're going to now have another one here coming relatively soon. How far off? October.
Mm-hmm.
Relatively soon, when we're going to have one at the earlier stage as well. Now, let's say that we've got some listeners here who are in a blended family situation. One of the temptations, and we've talked about this in the context of other issues, but one of the temptations is the sort of yours, mine, and ours perspective where you divide things up, and where we would look at Addison as your grandchild, and the children of the children that I raised would be my grandchildren. That's not what we want to do, is it?
No.
I mean, we want to be...
Well, every matriarch makes their decision, and that's not what this matriarch has decided.
Right.
And that's not what you have done as the patriarch of our home.
Right.
I mean, we have... You can't stand on the line and protest for pro-life and talk to abortionists, and then in your own family reject families coming together. I mean, it gives a false impression that you are saying one life is more important than another.
Right.
And you're not. You're showing partiality.
Right.
And in Christ, we don't do that. I think there is a tendency to think, well, this is flesh of my flesh and bone of my bone. And it is. But Riley and Donovan are not flesh of our flesh and bone of our bone. They're born of our heart.
They are our children.
Yeah. And so we don't treat them differently.
No. Now, that reminds me, this is really not on topic, but it is an opportunity for me to speak well of you. We also want to minister to those outside our immediate sphere of authority in a way that is helpful and understanding, which led us yesterday, you being the more zealous, outgoing one, saying to me, hey, hon, why don't we call the boy that's in our neighborhood? Why don't we call this boy, I won't mention his name, in and pray over him because he starts a new school tomorrow and he's a little bit nervous about it. And we can pray over him. And I said, well, I love the idea. I'm just not sure that, I would want
Let's
the
check
neighbors
with his
taking
school.
our kids to pray when we don't know what they believe. So let's check with the mom. And,
Right.
and you sent that message
Well,
out.
the grandmother.
The grandmother, right. But that's where your heart is. It doesn't just end at the bloodline or at the legal adoption line. It extends to people who are in need and people who are hurt. Exactly.
Well, let's talk about Isaiah 58.
Yes.
That is what true fasting is. If we want to be recognized in the kingdom of God, it's the least of these that we are always bearing our heart to.
Right. And
our hand.
In this situation, we've got a young man, a boy, who has
lost both of his parents.
One to alcoholism.
Just to drugs, substance abuse.
Okay, substance abuse. And then was living with his grandparents. And just a month ago,
well, 3 months ago his mom died,
okay.
and then 4 months ago his grandpa died. So we have an 80-plus-year-old grandmother raising a 12-year-old boy, and grieving, and he has special needs because of the parents that he had.
Right.
And so he has been at our doorstep every day since he's moved in with his grandma this summer, and 10 o'clock in the morning, 9 o'clock in the morning, hair a mess, disheveled. He just wants to be here, and we're And we're glad to have him.
Well, there's a reason he wants to be here. Part of it is our boys, but dear, part of it's you. He feels your love. You are a mother in Israel. I appreciate you. I'm proud of you, and I love you.
I love you too, honey.
It's shameful how we falsely stereotype the Bible. I honestly think it goes something like this, that when we're committed and zealous to read through our Bibles, we start in the book of Genesis and we make it through, and there's so many of those stories that we're familiar with from when we were kids. So we make it through Genesis, we get to Exodus, and it's the sort of outpouring and working out of what we saw in the Ten Commandments movie. Maybe a little bit of law here and there that can bog us down some, but we make it through. And then we get to Leviticus and we get to all these laws, and we just get stopped dead in our tracks. And then we assume that the book of Numbers is yet another boring book full of difficult to pronounce names and censuses and genealogies, and we just give up on reading through the Bible. Well, my job here is to give you the book of Numbers in just a few minutes, and I want to tell you, it's a great book. It's a great book filled with important lessons, as well as all sorts of drama and excitement. And I want to commend it to you. It's not a dry, boring book. This is the story of how the children of Israel got to the Promised Land and then ended up having to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. What we see is a powerful exposition of God's grace to his people and his people's lack of gratitude toward him. It is the book, they ought to call it, instead of Numbers, they ought to call it Grumbles or Grumblers, because this is the book where people are grumbling every time you turn around. They're grumbling, and God delivers them, God hears their cries, and they still don't trust him. You know, this whole Exodus event is a great place to dive deeply into the R.C. Sproul Jr. principle of hermeneutics. We need to see and be aghast and appalled at the grumbling, the complaining, the rebellion, the fickleness of God's people, and then realize, hey, that's just like me. That's what I do. Think about it this way. If you're listening to me, chances are, not 100% certain, but chances are you are living in more comfort and financial security than 99% of the people who've ever walked on this earth. And yet, chances are, and by the way, I know this because I know me, chances are you have struggled with a lack of gratitude. You haven't been sufficiently grateful to God for his provision. You have grumbled and complained. You've had fears and worries. It's what we do, because it's what we are. We don't trust God. But one of the reasons God gives us his word is so that we can read over and over again about his faithfulness, even in the face of our grumbling. And that's what Numbers is all about. God being kind, God being patient, God being gracious. God, even when he sends discipline to his people, he's sending it to them for their sake. That they would wake up and realize how loving and tender and gracious and kind he is. We see, again, another illustration that I always use for the R.C. Sproul Jr. principle of hermeneutics, when the 12 men are sent out to spy out the land, and they all come back, and only Caleb and Joshua are willing to say, yes, God will deliver this land into our hands. The other 10 are afraid, saying, no, there's nothing God can do. This one demonstrates how even in the midst, even after witnessing the most astonishing deliverance in the history of the world, these people still weren't ready to trust God. And secondly, that chances are that's just what we would have done had we been there. We just gratuitously assume that we would be Joshua and Caleb, when the odds are, 5 to 6 that we wouldn't be. So, this should be a book that we should come to eager to read, to see the tender and patient heart of the living God, to see our own weaknesses and our failures and our uncertainties and our lack of faith, to see God's deliverance and every reason that we have to trust Him and to live in light of the faith that we're called to, and to rest in the assurance that though it may be difficult, though it may be long, though it may not happen as swiftly as we might like, He is in fact leading us through the wilderness of this life to the promised land, the land flowing with milk and honey, the land of rest, which is eternity. Spend some time. There are, those places that probably no one would want to preach a sermon on in this book, but don't let that scare you away. Take the time to enter into the story, and when you see all those names and all those difficult things, let that be a reminder to you that these were real people, just like you and me. You've been listening to the Jesus Changes Everything podcast, a production of Dunamis Fellowship, the teaching outreach of Dr. R.C. Sproul Jr. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we encourage you to subscribe, which you can do at all the usual outlets, to tell your friends, and to spread the word. To learn more about the work of Dunamis Fellowship, please visit rcsproulJR.com. And join us next time on Jesus Changes Everything.